So I'm currently in the middle of a huge SAO marathon where I go back and rewatch every single mainline property of the series. I already made a video on the Aincrad and Alfheim arcs, link in the description if you're interested, and as you'd expect, this is a video on the Phantom Bullet and Mother's Rosario arcs, aka all of Sword Art Online Season 2. Even without watching my review of the first season though, I'm sure you can already imagine what my thoughts on it were. The first iteration of this franchise is notoriously bland and poorly executed, and honestly, despite my nostalgia, I ended up not really getting much out of my time with the show. And so going into the season, I was fully expecting that despite my fond memories of watching this show when it first came out, I would end up falling in with the crowd and pulling a metaphorical tomato out of a metaphorical basket in order to lampoon the series with criticism after scathing criticism. But to my genuine and unadulterated surprise, I didn't actually end up disliking the show the way I expected to. In fact, I found myself genuinely enjoying some parts of it despite my low expectations. Then, as soon as I lowered my guard for a mere moment, the second half of the show kicked me in the shins and laughed at me for even daring to feel joy in this cold and miserable world. But despite the way things turned out, I did come out of this rewatch with a genuine appreciation for the Phantom Bullet arc, so let's not waste any more time and get into it. So the Phantom Bullet arc of the show covers episodes 1 through 14, and one of my biggest problems with it, weirdly enough, is similar to how I felt about the Aincrad arc of Season 1. I just wish we could have spent more time in the world of the Phantom Bullet arc. We spent the entirety of the first season in 2 video games, both of them being of the fantasy genre. And while I think the world of Aincrad was pretty solid, there were a lot more possibilities that could have been explored when looking at a fully immersive virtual reality game. In the conclusion of SAO Season 1, Kirito gives anyone the ability to create worlds in a virtual setting by releasing the world seed of the original Sword Art Online. Because of this, a massive variety of games pop up, since now anyone has the opportunity to make their visions into reality through VR. And out of all the possible games that could exist in this setting, I really like that Gun Gale Online is the one that we get to spend this arc in. After 25 episodes of dragons and fairies and swords, I think setting a story in a cyberpunk post-apocalyptic land was the best decision the series could have possibly made. And the amazing thing is that it's a decision only this franchise can make. No other story can shift settings and worlds as quickly as Sword Art Online can, which is honestly one of the reasons I continue to enjoy this franchise despite everything. If you look solely at the series' ideas, especially in regards to new sci-fi tech, this would probably be one of the greatest sci-fi stories of all time. The only problem is that the other aspects of the show, like the pacing or characters, often struggle to reach the benchmark made by the story conceptually. But anyway, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. The shift from a pretty generic and overdone fantasy vibe to this cool, grungy aesthetic is the one that's really welcome. Honestly, I just had a lot of fun being surprised by the world of this franchise once again, and I would have really enjoyed being able to examine more sides of this world, rather than just going back to ALO for the second half of the season. But on top of the world of GGO just being really unique, the mechanics of this first-person shooter VR game are actually really well thought out and put together. In SAO, there wasn't much complexity to the actual gameplay of the, game. You could swing your sword, you could block with your sword, and you could activate sword skills to swing your sword in fancier and cooler ways. Despite there being weapons in the game beyond just swords, the mechanics of it all were never really any more interesting than that. And while this wasn't that noticeable of an issue, it kinda lets us forget sometimes that the world the characters were inhabiting is actually just a game. In Aincrad at least, this works fine. The whole point of the story was that the game is now real to these characters, and beating the audience over the head with mechanics and game terminology could have kinda detracted from that central theme. But the more fleshed out and unique way that GGO works was a welcome change to be sure. Instead of trying to hide that the main characters were playing a game, this season instead chose to embrace it. In many scenes in the show, you regularly get to look through a character's perspective and see the user interface of the game in all of its technical detail. And speaking of those details, there's a lot more of them in the season to catch your eye. For example, whenever one of the main characters, Sinon, looks through their sniper scope, you can actually see the amount of zoom changing on the left side of the screen. And while this may seem like a really tiny thing and nothing to be impressed by, it's just more which adds to the feeling that this is actually a video game that exists, with mechanics that make sense to be in a video game of this type. And I think one of the coolest pieces of creative problem solving in the series comes in the form of these mechanics. How would one create an immersive virtual reality first-person shooter where the bullets move just as fast as they do in real life and are also extremely powerful? There's a reason many shooter games in the real world have slower bullets, larger health pools, or just really fast respawn time. It would never fly to play a game where every interaction just comes down to who's able to shoot first, since that would be insanely unbalanced and not really that fun. And this challenge would be even more annoying for GGO since it's not only a virtual reality game, but also an MMO. Since you have full control of your player character, there's a lot more ways to ambush your opponent and generally make life pretty miserable for them. And since it's a game where you lose resources or weapons every time you die in the field, being killed constantly through unavoidable methods would make it pretty annoying. And having it be an RPG also makes it so you can't just increase players' health pools since that's assumedly a stat you need to upgrade in the game. And past all of that, how do you make this same game not only plausible as an actual video game, but also clearly understandable to the audience who's watching this as part of the anime? Well, the solution that Sword Art Online came up with were these prediction lines. When someone is aiming at you with the intent to fire, prediction lines start to show up on your screen displaying the trajectory that bullets will take. These prediction lines show up a very short window before the bullets are actually fired, but this is enough time for you to realize that you're in danger and try to move behind some cover away from said danger. These prediction lines don't show up if you're being aimed at by a sniper, which you haven't yet detected, but after you know of the sniper's existence, the prediction lines will once again show up. This is just a really interesting way of creating a first-person VR game. It lets the audience get a clear grasp of where bullets are firing and when the main character is in danger, and they also add a level of tension since you know wherever these lines hit, a bullet is not long to follow. And this is only one side of things. The aiming system is also pretty interesting. When you're using a weapon, the moment you put your finger on the trigger, a circle will appear on the screen which displays a spot the bullet will randomly land inside. The circle is directly linked to your heart rate, which means the more calm you are, the better you can aim. For a fully immersive game, this is a really cool concept which makes fights interesting and tense. And this is only a few of the many details added to this arc which make the world of GGO feel more well thought out. These elements may seem inconsequential to a lot of you watching, but it's things like this that take a world from good to great. Without these well thought out mechanics, this would have just been SAO but with guns, but instead GGO feels believable and concrete. And kinda tangential to that, I want to talk about Kirito for a bit. So Kirito has had a problem of being super overpowered in a lot of the properties he's in. It's a running joke, and according to a lot of people, this is a problem in this season of the show too. But surprisingly, I actually didn't see it as much. Kirito finds this rip-off lightsaber and uses it as a sword throughout the arc. He's able to dodge and cut down bullets midair using his training from living in a game for 2 years. And this isn't the worst justification I've seen for giving the main characters powers. Coming from games like SAO and ALO, both of which were very reliant on movement and reflexes, the prediction lines in GGO would have made dodging bullets pretty simple. Throw in a sword which can cut through bullets and bam, a pretty good reason for Kirito to be really damn good at this game even though it's his first time playing. The series also shows a surprising amount of restraint by making Kirito pretty bad at shooting guns, only being able to hit targets from close range and with a bit of luck. This power of his gets a little bit ridiculous when he's able to cut down a bullet without using said prediction lines shot from a rifle by the best sniper in the game at a range of about 5 meters, but for the most part it's decently believable. Where things start to go off the rails is when Kirito gains this power to visualize his surroundings by concentrating his senses to their max. I don't know where this came from, it's not really addressed anywhere, and he's suddenly able to feel the bloodlust of his enemies by closing his eyes and breathing a little, but this power is only really used twice, so it's not that bad. And let me just say, the animation for Kirito dodging bullets and cutting them down is way cooler than it has any right to be. It's so fluid and the sound design of the bullets being deflected is so crisp, I could honestly just watch this on loop for hours. And while we're on the subject, I realize I kinda skipped past a lot of the technical details of the show earlier on, so let's just go back and touch on those for a moment. First off, I think the director of the series really stepped up their game from season 1 to season 2. The same person did both of these shows, but honestly the shot choice for the second season is a lot more interesting than it was for the first. There's some actually unique and breathtaking scenes which work together to capture the action in a new and surprising way. As I talked about earlier, the choice to frame a lot of shots through the view of the main character really immerses us in the flow of it all and suddenly reminds us that the proceedings are all from a video game. I will say that similarly to the first season, there's a lot of fanservice-like shots, especially of the heroine, Sinon, which really just sucked and dragged the series down. This section of the show overall had a much darker tone than any of the rest of SAO up until this point, but that tone was constantly challenged by the jarring nature of some lowbrow shots in this. And I want to talk about the tone more in a bit, so don't forget about it. Similarly to the last season of the show, the animation holds up really well and captures the feeling of this world perfectly. Combat is always fluid and exhilarating, and combined with the soundtrack gives rise to some pretty tense and exciting moments. And speaking of that soundtrack, damn is it actually really f***ing good. I didn't comment on it with the first season since it didn't really feel exceptional in any regard, but the music in the show is really solid and underscores the dark atmosphere really well. And speaking of that, it's time to talk about that tone for a bit. Despite how the tone is butchered occasionally by the fan service of this show, for the most part, this half of the season retains a fairly dark and dreary vibe. And I cannot stress enough how much of a welcome change this was. The original Aincrad arc of season 1 just absolutely refuses to let the tone get dark. The first episode builds up the tension pretty well, the second episode kinda retains it, the third episode tries desperately to utilize this dark tone, and then every episode past that just swings the pendulum in the exact opposite direction. No tension, no stress, barely anything has emotional impact, it's just sad, and not tonally sad either. It's like blundering all your potential after 3 disjointed episodes kinda sad. And don't even make me talk about the other arc in that show. But the Phantom Bullet arc not only utilizes a darker tone, it revels in it. The atmosphere and the slow buildup of tension throughout the show fit the story so perfectly. Everything plays into this, the world of GGO being run down and dystopian, the main characters having surprising depth and trauma, the music and animation and pacing, just everything fits into place so cleanly. And the tone is so important to the story too. In the first season, I rarely felt any of the sad stuff which happened in the show. By the end of it, thousands of people were dead due to one man's actions, but honestly, the weight of that number isn't properly conveyed or given value. In the entirety of the Phantom Bullet arc, only 4 characters actually die, and none of them have backstories or exceptionally developed personalities. Yet I still felt these deaths so much more than I did any of the deaths in the Aincrad arc, with the notable exception of like Sachi. And true, we didn't get to see many of those deaths up close and personal in Season 1, but that's a problem on its own. The weight of life is never respected. In the Phantom Bullet arc, the threat of death is rarely as concrete as it was in any of the earlier seasons. We don't know if the villain is even truly responsible for the deaths that we suspect he is. But the feeling of danger is a lot more ever-present in this arc, which is due in large part to the darker tone. And that tone does a lot to help the show in terms of its characters. As I stated in my SAO Season 1 video, most of the characters in that show are really shallow. The show was rife with surface-level characters with surface-level motivations doing actions that, beyond their first impressions, had no thought or effort put into them. There were no motifs or symbols or really anything of note. And while I've heard a lot of complaints about the Phantom Bullet arc being similarly poorly done, I honestly think otherwise. Firstly, let's talk about Sinon, my favorite character in the season and in the entire show up until this point. Sinon is someone with a troubled past. Their father died when they were younger, leading them to live with their grandparents and only see their mother occasionally. On one trip to the post office when Sinon was young, a man armed with a gun walks into the building and attempts to rob the establishment. He ends up shooting a man in the chest and threatens Sinon's mom, at which point Sinon attacks him and manages to get a hold of his gun. The man runs at Sinon and tries to attack her to take the gun back, but Sinon is able to use the gun to shoot the man to death. This event leaves her traumatized. Throughout the rest of her life, up until the time of the main story, Sinon gets intense panic attacks at the sight of guns or gun-related imagery. This PTSD is so intense that Sinon starts to panic even when looking at finger guns. She has had to deal with this trauma for years after the incident, eventually moving to get away from the people who knew her past. But at some point she's introduced to the game GGO, a first-person VR shooter game. When she plays the game, she's surprised to find out that she doesn't feel an aversion to the guns in the game like she does in real life. She eventually plays this game in order to try and overcome her trauma and soon becomes completely invested. She correlates strength in the game with the ability to deal with trauma, so she invests time and effort into the game in order to prove herself stronger than anyone else. She thinks that when her player character is able to overcome the strongest person in GGO, she'll become strong enough in the real world to overcome her past. And like right off the bat, this is miles ahead of anything we got in the first season. Sinon has depth and motivation that goes beyond mere survival instincts. She doesn't just want to survive, she has a past she wishes to overcome and grow past. And this is the primary thing which motivates her in the story. Even our very first introduction to this character shows how much she cares about this game. To her, it's not a simple matter of fun or entertainment. This game is a way for her to improve her own life. I will say another problem I've seen people talk about in terms of the show is that it just doesn't make sense for people to care about this game so much. And for Sinon, I think it kind of does make sense considering this is her coping mechanism and the path for her to overcome her trauma. And similarly, I think it makes sense for Kirito to care about this game since he's assigned a mission by the government to stop the villain who may possibly be killing people through the game. We'll get to that later. But I can't deny that for the rest of the characters, it's a little bit weird. Like, the final tournament completely works. It makes sense why everyone is as invested as they are. Even the preliminaries, like this is a chance to prove yourself the best player in Japan. That's a big deal, so I actually sympathize with the people and how much they're sweating. But it doesn't really hold up at length. Like, in the start of the show when this character starts breaking down and looks on the verge of crying because ambushed failed in a video game, yeah, I kinda thought it was a bit dumb. Like, I play games, I understand gamer rage, that doesn't mean I sympathize with a guy who's having, like, a mental breakdown over this stuff. Sinon, I can understand. She has a clear reason to care as much as she does. Everyone else, though, didn't really earn my sympathy. I understand why the show is done this way. It would have made it worse if the characters were detached and flippant over everything since it's just a game, but it's kind of an unfortunate side effect of the setting. But to go into more depth with Sinon's role in the main story, we first need to talk about Kirito. When Kirito first joins GGO, he's randomly given a pretty feminine looking character model. When looking for someone to help him out, Kirito asks Sinon to show him the ropes, misleading her into helping him by acting like a girl. But then, surprise, Kirito's kind of a for doing this. Sinon unknowingly goes into a changing room with him, and then Kirito panics and explains the truth to Sinon. Sinon gets understandably mad at him, and the two are kind of at odds for the next few episodes. Honestly, I'd say one of my biggest problems with the story is that she kind of forgives him too easily, and he doesn't repent nearly enough for his actions. But despite me not liking the fan service aspect of it, and despite how much I dislike Kirito for this, compared to a lot of the other BS in this show, this kinda makes sense a bit. Sinon has like a slight aversion to men after the trauma she sustained from the incident at the post office, so there would have been very little chance for Kirito and Sinon to interact if she knew he was a man. But even though it makes sense from a storytelling perspective, that doesn't make it any more fun to watch as a viewer. But anyway, that's not the part of Sinon and Kirito's relationship that I want to talk about. Kirito relates to Sinon because of his past life in Sword Art Online. We learned that in the game, Kirito participated in a raid on the famous guild of murderers known as Laughing Coffin. These guys are a guild of players who kill other players, but since if you die in SAO, you die in real life, most members of this group are essentially murderers. So many of the strongest fighters in Aincrad go on a raid of their base, hoping to safely subdue them and stop their killings. Unfortunately, the plane is leaked, which causes the raid to go south. During the chaos, Kirito ends up being forced to kill 2 members of Laughing Coffin as they refuse to surrender in peace. Kirito tried to desperately forget about this, and he actually managed to succeed. The idea of killing 2 people with his own hands weighed heavily on his mind, causing him to blot the memory out completely. Kirito's main motivation in the story is to catch this player named Deathgun, who is suspect of stopping the hearts of 2 GGO players by killing them in the game. When confronting Deathgun in-game, Kirito notices a tattoo of Laughing Coffin's logo on his arm, which causes all the memories Kirito's repressed to come flooding back. I won't really talk about how dumb it is that Deathgun has both of his arms fully covered, yet fails to cover up the one piece of information that could serve to identify him, but it is kind of dumb. Anyways, Kirito recalls the people he kills, and he feels exceptionally bad for this since he not only was the direct cause of their death, but he also went on living in peace, forgetting about the sins he committed. Kirito is understandably shook by this, so later when Sinon, who's still mad at him by the way, approaches Kirito to taunt him, she notices his temperament. In this moment, Sinon recognizes the same guilt and anguish she experiences daily on Kirito's face. This shocks and unnerves her and instantly draws a connection between the two of them. This is where the cracks start to appear in Sinon's personality in-game. Seeing the same emotions she goes through on full display reminds her of her own past and present trauma. This is the first thing which softens Sinon to Kirito's existence after he wronged her earlier. With that being said, I still think Sinon shows a little bit too much too quickly. She let slip lines which hint at her mental state, and while I understand that this may be necessary for some people to understand her thought process, I think it just doesn't really make sense for her to act like this. Even in the real world, and especially in the game, Sinon refuses to show emotions or to open up to people. She thinks it makes her weak, which is the opposite of what she works towards on a daily basis. Even knowing that Kirito and Sinon's connections start to put cracks in her stone-cold exterior, I think they may have rushed it a little bit. The two of them have a heart-to-heart later in the story, which makes sense, and I'll talk about later, but the two of them also share a similar conversation way earlier in the story. This emotional confrontation happens before Kirito and Sinon really make up in any way, and before Sinon has much reason to actually want to confide in Kirito. Sinon builds up Kirito as this really strong person in her head, which results in her wanting to beat him to assure her own strength, again lining up with her overarching motivations. But when they finally meet in the field, Kirito refuses to fight Sinon since he's already qualified for the tournament and has thus already achieved his goal. Kirito is cold and detached at this point since he's been shocked and confused by the reminder of the people he killed in the past. Sinon gets mad at Kirito for attempting to throw the match, which kind of jolts Kirito back to life, and ends in the two of them fighting it out. Kirito wins this interaction, which I find dumb, but I can kinda understand the reasoning for since it's necessary for the purpose of the story, but this reaffirms Sinon's idea that Kirito is strong, even though he seems to share the same type of trauma she does. I think Sinon's behavior before and after this is pretty reasonable, but this is one of the main things I think is weird in terms of the characters. I feel like Sinon opens up to Kirito too soon, all things considered. Sometimes less is more, and removing this bit of out-of-character progression or toning it down a bit would make the story flow a lot better. The best way to describe it is to say that Sinon's openness goes on a slow upwards curve as the story goes on. But the preliminaries of the tournament is like a sudden spike. It fits her character, but it just seems like too much too soon. But in any case, this parallel between Kirito and Sinon is one of the best things SAO has ever done in terms of its characters. And another place where this parallel shows up is in the dynamic duo's interactions with Deathgun. So Deathgun, on top of being the literal murderer that Sinon and Kirito have to stop, is also the intersection and embodiment of both of their traumas, which I think is really neatly done. Deathgun, as I said earlier, is a member of the Laughing Coffin Guild, and one of them which Kirito remembers but can't recall the name of. But even just the reminder of this is enough to send Kirito panicking. On top of this though, Deathgun also happens to wield the exact same pistol that Sinon used to shoot the robber some years ago, and when Sinon sees this pistol being used to kill again, she gets reminded of her own trauma. In this way, Kirito and Sinon both have to fight against this mysterious killer while also having to confront their past. Also, when I watched this series for the first time, I thought that it was just a dumb plot contrivance that Deathgun wields the exact same pistol that would remind Sinon of her past, but no, I'm pleasantly surprised to report that apparently SAO is better than that now. Anyways, on top of just being narratively satisfying, the link between Kirito and Sinon also conveys a pretty cool moral. While Kirito and Sinon are both being forced to confront their past, Kirito gets over his problems a lot sooner than Sinon does, and this isn't just because Kirito is the main character like you'd expect. As I talked about earlier, Sinon doesn't really have many people to rely on. The one person who she can call a friend in either the real or virtual world is secretly a crazed maniac who is manipulative and really creepy. So yeah, not much in the way of emotional support. Kirito on the other hand is a bit stoic, but for some reason or the other he ends up confiding in the nurse the government assigned to monitor his vitals. He asks her if he's a bad person for forgetting the people he killed, and she reassures him that killing those people was the only way to survive. She tells Kirito to live life for the living and to remember those he has wronged, but not to obsess over these actions in the past. And this is what ultimately allows Kirito to overcome his past troubles. It's a bit out of nowhere for this random nurse lady to be the one who's comforting Kirito when he already has an existing group of friends and family to talk to, but I guess sometimes it's easier to talk to people who have less to do with you, especially when you're so ashamed of your own actions. Anyway, this is the reason Kirito is so stalwart even in the face of his past. While he hasn't fully overcome it, he at least knows how to carry himself moving forward. But Sinon doesn't have the ability to do this. Even right after she killed the robber in the past, her own mother looked at Sinon like she was a monster. This lasting shame at having taken someone else's life prevents her from seeking out help, which leads to her breaking down in front of her own past. This then leads to the big moment between Kirito and Sinon when she finally opens up to him about her past and tells Kirito about it. She thinks that Kirito can tell her some secret to how to be strong and stoic in both the game and in real life, which ironically leads her to finally open up and rely on someone fully. Kirito in turn tells Sinon the exact same thing that the nurse told him, to not let the past weigh you down, but also to not forget about the things you're ashamed of. The lesson is eventually what allows Sinon to accept her past and start on the journey to healing. I think it's nice narratively that Kirito, someone who struggles with the same past that Sinon does, is the one who eventually alleviates some of her pain. And the way it's done is pretty nice as well. Kirito isn't some god who knows everything. He largely tells Sinon the same thing that he was told, taking the good lessons he learned and passing it forward for someone else to hear. I think they could have emphasized a little bit more that Kirito was similarly clueless and only managed to stay strong because of the people around him, but it's a good enough moral that the ham-fisted execution is a little bit excusable. And this is why I was so shocked by this season being as good as it was. To think that a character dynamic this strong would come out of a show with this rough of a past. Sinon and Kirito have parallels and their relationship conveys a clear message about the importance of support systems. Like, it's just so far beyond anything I would have imagined after looking at season 1. On the flip side of that though, the relationship between Sinon and Kirito sometimes undermines and is undermined by Kirito's relationship with Asuna. The fact that Kirito is out cozying up with another girl while he is still in a relationship with Asuna is just kind of uncomfortable. Asuna is such a little part of this arc that I often forgot about her, but if the best way to enjoy a show is to forget about one of its characters completely, that's a problem. I wouldn't have found it that weird if Kirito and Sinon's relationship was completely platonic and Kirito wasn't basically leading her on, but that's not what the writers chose. And to a point, I think this makes sense. It would have been kind of weird if Kirito and Sinon were having a heart-to-heart and Kirito was literally helping Sinon through a panic attack, and he was suddenly like, oh wait, sorry, I can't comfort you, I'm already taken. I think this would have just made things worse, but if you think about things for a second too long, some of the interactions between Kirito and Sinon get a lot more uncomfortable to watch. Before I wrap things up, let's just quickly talk about the main villain of this arc, Deathgun, and the elephant in the room that is the ending. I think that the first season of SAO was lacking in a lot of ways, and one of the biggest underutilized aspects of the show was Laughing Coffin, or the idea of the Murderers Guild in the game. This is such an interesting idea since it kind of shines a light on how cruel humans can be. Since murder and violence is so easy and beneficial in a game like SAO, normal people in the real world can turn into monsters. This concept is explored so superficially in the first season, and I find it funny that the second season does monumentally more with this plot point than I ever would have imagined. So the big mystery during most of the season pertains to how Deathgun is able to kill people from a VR game. The two people that were originally killed by Deathgun were last seen online being shot by Deathgun and then promptly disconnecting from the game. They were then found in their rooms dead of a heart attack a few days later. The VR system used by the players isn't capable of interfering with the user's heart in any way, and the rooms the players were found in were both locked. On top of that, the developer of the game is a foreign company that is operating behind closed doors and isn't responding to any inquiries. And genuinely, I think this is a pretty solid setup for a murder mystery. It's a locked doors murder that clearly indicates something as the method of killing that, by the logic of this world, should be clearly impossible. Kirito has his initial theories, but ultimately has no idea how those two people died through the exact same means. Throughout his time in the game, Kirito picks apart Deathgun's behavior and comes to a realization about how Deathgun does his killing. Kirito realizes pretty reasonably that Deathgun has an accomplice in the real world who breaks into people's homes to drug them and stop their heart, and the killing of people in-game is perfectly planned to coincide with his partner's actions. There's a whole litany of clues which lead up to this, but I won't bore you with all of that. Suffice it to say though, it is pretty logically constructed and I was more than impressed. I think a super cool reveal is when Kirito realizes this and tells Sinon about it. By this point, the two have already teamed up to stop Deathgun, but Kirito noticed that Deathgun is attempting to shoot Sinon using his ceremonial black pistol that he only uses when killing people in the real world. This is done to keep up the illusion that the gun is the one doing the killing and not some other force. Noticing this, Kirito realizes that there must be someone in Sinon's room, waiting to kill her at any moment. It's a bone-chilling realization, and Sinon appropriately panics and almost gets booted from the game due to her heart rate going too high. This moment was really well built up to and is really unnerving in all the right ways. It's later revealed that the people behind Deathgun were two former members of Laughing Coffin and one of their siblings, who happened to be the manipulative jerk that Sinon was friends with. The two Laughing Coffin members don't have the most complex motivations, but they are interesting and they at least make sense, unlike some other villains in this show. They were part of Laughing Coffin in the first place because of their desire to murder, so after they got out of the game, they struggled to find purpose in life. Unable to return to their murderous glory days in Aincrad, they instead found purpose in using the guise of Deathgun to kill people in mockery of the way they killed in Aincrad. And this makes sense. People who base their entire lives around killing would obviously find it hard to detach themselves from that when they return to reality, resulting in the creation of Deathgun as a concept. The other kid, however, Kyoji, the little brother of one of the two Laughing Coffin members, is a little bit worse. He's under a lot of pressure to succeed his father's hospital, which pushed him to escape to video games, but in GGO he listened to the advice of some of the top players, which resulted in him ruining his character build and making him stagnate. He decides to take out his anger by helping his brother with his plan in killing some of the best players in the game. This motivation is a bit weird and seems really petty, but on the other hand it's not like we're supposed to sympathize with this guy, so it kinda works out. His other main shtick throughout the story is that he's obsessed with Sinon in a stalkerish way. He manipulates her and tries to get her to go out with him, and he weirdly idolizes the fact that she killed somebody in the past, and it turns out that he was the one that gave Deathgun the pistol she used in order to pay homage to her actions. It's uncomfortable, but as I said, we're not supposed to like the guy, so I mean, mission accomplished. The problem comes somewhere near the end of the arc, where he is yet to reveal himself as a villain and is sitting with Sinon in her room. She realizes that he's acting a bit suspicious and calls him out on possibly being connected to the villain, at which point he confesses and tries to assault her. And I have to ask, why the f is this becoming a thing now? First the Alfheim arc of Season 1 and now this? Why is it like a motif for strange men to try and assault people only to be slapped around by Kirito? The scene is very disturbing and it's realistic in the most uncomfortable ways. Nothing ends up happening luckily, and it fits better with this story than the last because of the arc's general darker tone, but it's still not fun. Kirito runs in and kind of helps Sinon at one point, but he ends up almost dying in the process and is saved by Sinon, which I think is a pretty neat and satisfying conclusion to see Sinon brain the guy who was manipulating her the whole time. I just say watch out if you get to this point in the show, because it's a pretty sudden, if justified, spike in intensity. And that was the entire Phantom Bullet arc. So much better than any of what came before it. I think no matter how you look at it, this is just objectively a better entry into the franchise than either of the earlier arcs. Many of the aspects were on par with Season 1, and the characters and mystery just took it to the moon. I think Aincrad still had a better premise, but that can only earn it so much praise. The tone and atmosphere, everything about this makes it feel like a completely new show. And aside from some of the scenes with the old characters, I honestly think you may be able to watch this arc with only knowing the bare minimum context about this world. I'd say the problems with this show are just that it muddles the execution for a lot of the great character and narrative ideas it has. You may have not been able to tell from my explanation, but especially with the character stuff, some ideas are way too openly conveyed and some are super obscure and require a fine comb to understand. There's also just a bit too much mediocrity here to make it truly exceptional. But compared to what came before, it is just an insane improvement. As you can probably tell by how much I talked about this arc, I was really passionate about it, and I won't lie, I'm not that attached or passionate to the next arc in this show. It's a real letdown coming off the heels of this arc, so I just don't have that much to say. I'll touch on what I want to, but excuse me if I don't go nearly as in-depth as I did here. So, apologies for misspeaking earlier, but there are actually two arcs which follow the Phantom Bullet arc in Season 2. The Mother's Rosario arc is a lot more memorable, which isn't saying much, but I just kind of referred to everything after the Phantom Bullet arc this way, which is technically incorrect. So, technically speaking, episodes 15, 16, and 17 are all part of the Calibur arc, and then from there to the end of the season is actually the Mother's Rosario arc. And for both of these, just assume the animation and all that jazz are basically on the same level as the Phantom Bullet arc, because it's the same season and there isn't going to be much difference in those aspects. One thing that is very different between the Calibur arc and the Phantom Bullet arc is the tone. God, the Calibur arc just does not work for me. Coming off the dark and dreary atmosphere of GGO and the general edgier vibe of that entire arc, Calibur is a mess of nonsense and convolution. To start off with, nothing matters. I'm sorry, the problem I talked about earlier in the video about it being weird for people to care so much about this stupid video game they're playing, yeah, that is so in play here. Breaking new ground, the Calibur arc doesn't claim that people will die if things go poorly in the game. It doesn't even claim that people will be hurt if things go poorly in the game. Instead, the stakes are that the video game will break if the main characters fail at this one quest. Oh no. Okay, sure, the main characters may care about this, and that's great for them. They're definitely weird for it, but fine, I can accept that. But how in any way am I supposed to relate to them? The earlier arcs made the stakes relatable. Death, incarceration, humiliation, these are all things we can relate to because we fear similar things in our lives. SAO was formerly pretty smart for this because these stakes were the only things to make us somewhat care about these storylines despite them all taking place in a video game. We just don't share the same connection to ALO that the main characters do. In fact, I wouldn't bat an eye if SAO published an entire 3-hour special of ALO burning to the ground. So in this arc, how and why would I get invested in something I have no relation to? If things go south, great, go to GGO, it was a better game anyway. With that in mind, it would be fine if I didn't care about anything going on, if the storyline was at least a bit interesting and the general quality of the show was high enough to excuse that. And like, it's SAO, I don't know what you were expecting, but it's just not. The story is a weird melting pot of Norse mythology, despite the writers not really understanding what Norse mythology is, or just not caring about it. There's some references, there's some attempts at things that could be cool, but I think what best encapsulates this storyline is this. Excalibur is a European sword myth that either originated from the Irish or the Welsh. Notice something here. Why is a sword of Irish or Welsh fame the centerpiece of a story about Norse mythology? Why is a pretty bog-standard spoof of the Nordic mythos combined with a sword that's not at all Norse in nature? Why not use any other weapon that was actually Norse, most famously Mjolnir, but also Gungnir, Gleipnir, just play God of War, goddammit. Oh, actually, scratch everything I just said. I know why they made it Excalibur, because that's the most famous sword that fits the description of a sword Kirito would use. And of course, no other person in Kirito's party deserves a cool new weapon, only Kirito does, because he's Kirito, and he's strong and cool and f***ing... I know for a fact some SAO writer is just gonna comment on this and be like, oh, it's an artistic spoof of mythology-based stories, you just don't understand, you know? And I'm gonna cry. Anyways, moving on from that, there's only one other thing I want to talk about, and it's just that the characters are back to how they were in Season 1. Hooray! Sinon, who just went through hell and back with Kirito, has now been relegated to Kirito Simp number 5, and that's basically all she does in this arc. I don't understand how you make a character as good as Sinon, give them an arc with a similarly enlightened version of Kirito, and then throw them on the same side burner as Silica, Klein, Liz, and f***ing Lifa. It's ridiculous, like they just finished Sinon's main arc and we're like, sweet, trauma over, character done, throw them out with the rest of the rejects. It's just so hard to see this character that I was honestly invested in put to the side in favor of Asuna, who I was completely not invested in anymore. Any semblance of appreciation I had for her character went out of the window when I saw what an actual good character coming out of the show looks like. It doesn't have to be romantic, just let Kirito and Sinon be really good friends, cause they were really good friends, more so than anyone else. They have a shared history, they improve each other's being, let them have a wholesome platonic relationship. Don't make it romantic and also shaft her from the main story. Don't do both. Actually, don't do either. Okay, that was a bit all over the place, but trust me, these 3 episodes didn't have much else to talk about. Anything I didn't mention was just kinda mediocre and forced for the most part. Bottom of the barrel, at least it was short, but it had nothing else going for it. Okay, final one. This is the actual Mother's Rosario arc, and you know what? Maybe it's just because of how low we went before, but it's actually got some things to offer. Returning to the trend as if the past 3 episodes were just a dream, this arc has possibly one of the best premises in SAO up until this point. The idea of full dive technology being used in the world of medicine makes so much sense. Helping terminally ill patients find joy in some way, even if it's living in a body that isn't their own, is such an interesting and logical way for this technology to be used. But with that slam dunk of an idea to springboard off of, the story didn't have the emotion it should have. The entire concept is that Asuna is now the main character and she's spending time with this group of players who want to beat a boss by themselves to carve some proof of existence into the world of the game. Turns out, the members of this group are all terminally ill patients using the technology of full dive to live life as much as they can in a virtual world. This is kind of framed as a twist in the story. We at first didn't know why this group called the Sleeping Knights want to make a name for themselves and then to disband.
But the problem is that there just wasn't enough time put into getting us invested before this twist paid off. Since this arc only takes up 7 episodes, less than any of the other arcs in the show besides Calibur, we don't get to know any of the Sleeping Knights nearly enough to make things hit hard. The twist is pretty good even with the minimal setup it had, but instead of being able to fully enjoy it, I was just left wondering how much better it could have been if we were given some more time. Just like with other concepts in this show, I think we could have really seen an entire spin-off show dedicated to this, where the characters meet and slowly form bonds in the virtual world only to discover the other person's state in the real world. That could have genuinely been heartbreaking, and I think it would have taken this concept to a whole new level. But instead, here we are with a 7-episode arc on it instead. It's a shame too, since unlike the Calibur arc, this continues the trend of making us care about a virtual world. The sentiments expressed by the members of the Sleeping Knights are pretty touching. Wanting to carve your name into the world literally or figuratively is really relatable, and it makes sense that these people who live life so close to death would want to expedite this process and make sure that they have a legacy to leave behind. But again, in practice, it just doesn't hit as hard as it should. We don't really care about any of the other Sleeping Knights except for the main girl, Yuki. We spend a lot of time with Yuki, and there encounter a new piece of interesting sci-fi tech. Kirito invented this device that would allow a virtual character to experience the real world using cameras and microphones. This is originally meant for his adopted daughter Yui, but is repurposed for Yuki's use so she can experience how it is to go to a normal school. A beautiful idea and concept, but just not enough time for us to truly start to care about it. And that's kind of the calling card of this arc. Amazing in concept, not even too bad in execution, but just the time allocated for it makes it so hard for these things to pace themselves properly. Aside from that, I also have a really big problem with Kirito and his whole overpowered main character thing. When Kirito is the main character, it's not that bad, but as soon as Asuna becomes the focus, Kirito just turns on God mode for some reason. Like at the start of this arc, Yuki is testing swordsmen to see who would be a good fit for her party. Asuna is the one chosen for this since she almost beat Yuki in a fight, but they insisted on adding a small interaction where Yuki explains that Kirito would have been chosen instead. However, he was partially able to figure out that Yuki was a terminally ill patient during his fight. Like, why can't they just let Asuna be stronger for a bit? Why are they so insistent that Kirito has to be the more powerful of the two, yet he's just too smart for his own good? This reflects badly on Asuna too, who is supposed to be our main character. And even later, Kirito and Klein are the ones to save Asuna and Yuki when they're being attacked, despite Kirito being explicitly left out of the guild's activities. He just rushes in and does his thing, which is such a distraction and a bit unnecessary. Even at the end, Kirito's the one who knows where Yuki is and the truth about her condition, and is the one who points Asuna towards it. Why couldn't Yuki's friends or Yuki herself relate this to her? Why did the godly and magnanimous Kirito have to bless us with this information instead? I think his invention of the device that Yuki pilots in the real world is great. It lines up with his motivations and gives him a big important role in the story. All these other things feel like instances of the writers being like, hey, I know you're trying to get invested in Asuna and Yuki's relationship, but don't forget we have a super strong and cool swordsman waiting on the sidelines to take the wheel at any moment. It is SAO, so I guess par for the course, but still, it distracts even more from the already anemic storyline of this arc. So that was SAO Season 2 reviewed in full. Thanks so much for watching to the end, and sorry for this being such a long video. I really wasn't expecting it to take this long. I just kind of started writing the script, and I continued writing, and eventually just the part for the first arc, the Phantom Bullet arc, came out to be 10 pages around by itself, which, yeah, I was not expecting, but it turned out well. I had a lot to say, and I'm glad that I got all of it across. If I had to rank every arc right now, I would say that the Phantom Bullet arc is at the top, because it just felt like a more whole and collected experience than any of the other arcs. Then it would be followed by the Aincrad arc, probably the Mother's Rosario arc, followed by the Calibur arc pretty far below that, and then finally the Alfheim arc, which I hate. In closing, I really liked the Phantom Bullet arc. I thought it was great, I really enjoyed it, but I just thought that it was filled with a little bit too much melodrama and a little bit too much was revealed too quick for my taste. Aside from that and some other uncomfortable moments and weird creative choices, I think it was honestly really, really good, for SAO standards, of course. Past all that, I really didn't get much out of my time with the Calibur arc. I appreciate the Mother's Rosario arc for existing because I think it had a really cool premise and some really cool ideas in it, which is more than I can say about the Calibur arc, but both of them kind of missed the mark for me in different ways. Anyways, if you managed to watch till here somehow, which I honestly would be surprised if anyone did, first off, thank you so much, and second off, please consider subscribing. I'm currently working on 2 more SAO videos, one on the Ordinal Scale movie, and the next one on the Alicization series, which I'm actually really excited for since Alicization is by far my favorite property, maybe aside from the Progressive movie. But yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in a few weeks. Bye!